History's most chilling prophecy says that when the Colosseum falls, Rome will fall, and when Rome falls, the entire world will crumble. For 1,000 years, this prediction has terrorized kings and popes alike. But its true author wasn't a mystic or a seer, but an English monk who never set foot in Rome. How is it possible that a man living in the mists of Northumbria could predict the fate of history's most powerful empire? The answer lies buried in an 8th century manuscript that forever changed our perception of the end times. But when you discover who really wrote these words and what they meant in their original context, your view of history will be completely transformed. Because it turns out this prophecy wasn't talking about the end of the world. It was talking about something much more subtle and powerful, the birth of a new civilization upon the ruins of the old. But how did an academic reflection become the apocalyptic prediction that still makes us shudder when we look at the Colosseum's ruins? While the Colosseum stands, Rome shall stand. When the Colosseum falls, Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, the world shall fall. These words have resonated for over 1,000 years like a cosmic death sentence. Every time an earthquake shakes the eternal city, every time a stone falls from its millennial walls, millions of people worldwide feel a chill. Are we one step closer to the end? This prophecy's power lies in its apparently unquestionable logic. The Colosseum is Rome. Its image is synonymous with the power, grandeur, and brutality of the empire that dominated the known world for centuries. Through its arenas paraded gladiators, exotic beasts brought from the ends of Africa, and according to Christian tradition, martyrs who chose death rather than renounce their faith. It is the symbol of absolute power materialized in travertine stone and marble. Therefore, logically, imagining its destruction leads us directly to visualize the collapse of everything it represents: order, law, civilization as we know it. During the Middle Ages, this idea became an obsession. Chroniclers recorded every new crack, every falling block, as if they were symptoms of a terminal illness afflicting all of Christendom. Pilgrims who came to Rome didn't just visit the apostles' tombs. They came to verify with their own eyes whether civilization's great hourglass was still marking time. Renaissance artists painted its ruins with a mixture of melancholy and warning. For them, the Colosseum was the most potent lesson about the vanity of human glories. Even when Rome resurged as the center of papal power, the prophecy remained alive, whispered in the Vatican's corridors, as a constant reminder that no power is eternal. 19th century Romanticism gave it the definitive push. Poets like Lord Byron immortalized it in their verses, making it the perfect metaphor for the fragility of empires. While its triumphal arches remain, Byron wrote, "Rome shall be. When they fall, Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, the world shall fall too." But here arises the first disturbing question. If this prophecy is so ancient and powerful, why doesn't it appear in any classical Roman text? Why do no empire historians, no chroniclers of Western decline, even mention it? The search for this prophecy's origin takes us through a labyrinth of medieval manuscripts, oral traditions, and legends that multiply like mushrooms in time's humidity. It doesn't come from a pagan oracle, as one might expect. It wasn't pronounced by any dying emperor nor carved on catacomb walls by early Christians. The phrase appears for the first time, clearly and documented, in the writings of a man who lived in the 8th century, when Rome was no longer an empire's capital, but a city struggling to redefine its identity in a completely transformed world. A man whose life transpired not on the eternal Seven Hills, but in the windy moors of northern England. His name was Bede. Today we know him as the Venerable Bede, doctor of the Church and father of English history. And here's where our investigation takes a completely unexpected turn, because this English monk not only never saw the Colosseum with his own eyes, but probably never left his natal monastery. How is it possible that a man living more than 1,000 kilometers from Rome, in an age without rapid communications, without photographs, without even accurate maps, could formulate the most famous prediction about the eternal city's destiny? And what does it really mean that the words that have terrorized the West for a millennium came from the pen of an academic who probably considered Rome more as a theological abstraction than a political reality. To understand the truth behind history's most famous prophecy, we must first ask, who really was the Venerable Bede? He wasn't a mystic receiving divine visions in ecstatic states. He wasn't a prophet interpreting celestial signs. He was, above all, an academic, the most brilliant intellectual of his time in the British Isles. But if Bede was a man of science and logic, why did he include this apocalyptic prophecy in his writings? Did he invent it himself as a theological reflection? Or did he take it from some source that has been lost forever? And more importantly, what did Rome really mean to an 8th century English monk? Bede was born around 672 in Monk Wearmouth, in the kingdom of Northumbria, in what is now northeastern England. At 7 years old, he was given to the monastery of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, where he would spend the rest of his life. His physical world was limited to those monastic walls, but his intellectual world had no boundaries. Bede himself described his existence with words that reveal his character. My constant pleasure has been in learning, teaching, or writing, and he certainly fulfilled that promise. During his life, which extended until 735, he produced a monumental work spanning theology, grammar, astronomy, mathematics, music, and history. He was a man ahead of his time. It was he who popularized the Anno Domini dating system, counting years from Christ's birth, the same system we use today. It was he who, in the middle of the 8th century, when many still believed in a flat earth, categorically stated that our planet was round like a game ball, based on ancient Greek teachings. His most famous work, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731, remains one of the most important sources for understanding early medieval England. Bede didn't just relate facts. He verified them with multiple sources, cited documents, interviewed witnesses. He was, in the modern sense of the word, a scientific historian. But to understand why Bede included the Colosseum prophecy in his writings, we must understand the world in which he lived. When he wrote those words, around 730, nearly 300 years had passed since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Rome that Bede knew from books was no longer a vast empire's capital, but a city with vanished political power and dramatically reduced population. And the Colosseum? By Bede's time, the Flavian amphitheater was no longer the vibrant spectacle center it had been during the centuries of imperial glory. Gladiatorial games had been banned centuries earlier by Christian emperors. The last recorded combat took place in 435, almost 3 centuries before Bede was born. By the time the English monk was writing his chronicles, the Colosseum was in a state of semi-abandonment that would have been unthinkable during the empire's height. Its corridors and basements had become improvised workshops, housing for the poorest, merchants' warehouses. There were areas serving as Christian cemeteries, and within its gigantic structure, small chapels had been built in an attempt to Christianize a place with a pagan and bloody past. This leads us to the central question that will revolutionize your understanding of this entire story. What did Colosseum really mean in Bede's time? Because here's the first great secret that 1,000 years of misinterpretation have hidden. The building we call the Colosseum was officially called the Flavian Amphitheater in honor of the dynasty that built it. The nickname Colosseum became popular much later, but not because of the building itself, but because of a colossal statue that stood right next to it, the Colosus Neronis, the Colossus of Nero. This statue, which measured more than 30 meters in height, originally represented Emperor Nero as the sun god. After Nero's death, it was modified several times by later emperors, but continued to dominate Rome's landscape for centuries. It was so impressive that Romans began calling the entire area Ad Colosseum, near the Colossus. When Bede wrote Colosseus in Latin, he was most likely referring to the statue, not the amphitheater. The statue that represented Rome's pagan grandeur, the symbol of divinized imperial power. But what implications does this have for our understanding of the prophecy? Was Bede really talking about a building's destruction or something much deeper? It's time to decode the true prophecy. Let's analyze the original Latin phrase that Bede recorded. Quam Deus stat Colosseus, stat et Roma. Quando cadet Colosseus, cadet et Roma. Quando cadet Roma, cadet et mundus. For a scholar like Bede, educated in the classical tradition but living in the Christian world, each word had layers of meaning that have been lost in modern translations. The first key, as we've seen, is in Colosseus, not the amphitheater, but the Colossus, the statue symbolizing pagan grandeur. The second key is in Roma. For Bede, writing in the 8th century, Rome was no longer just the physical city with its 7 hills. It was, above all, the new center of Christendom, the papal seat, the spiritual and cultural pillar that had replaced the political power of the ancient empire. It was the Rome of St. Peter, not the Rome of the Caesars. The third key is in mundus, the world. For an 8th century English monk, the world wasn't the entire planet as we understand it. It was the orbis Christianus, the civilized and known world, defined by Christian faith and the culture emanating from that new papal Rome. Now we can reread the prophecy with this new code. While the Colossus, the symbol of pagan grandeur, stands, so too will Rome, as the center of the new Christian civilization, legitimate heir to that grandeur. When the Colossus, that symbol of the pagan past, falls, so too will Rome, the Christian institution that has inherited its authority. And when Rome, that pillar of the new civilization, falls, the world, all Christian civilization as we know it, will fall. This reinterpretation completely changes our understanding of the prophecy. It wasn't a prediction about the physical destruction of planet Earth. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated political and cultural statement. Bede was saying that Christian civilization had successfully inherited the mantle of ancient Rome, that Rome's permanence, symbolized by its ancient monuments, was the guarantee of his own Christian world's permanence. He wasn't predicting the end of times in an apocalyptic sense. He was predicting the possible end of his time, the end of his specific civilizational order. It was a reflection on cultural continuity, not a prophecy of final judgment. This interpretation makes even more sense when we consider that in Bede's time, the Colossus of Nero still existed. In fact, it wasn't definitively destroyed until sometime in the 10th or 11th century, centuries after the English monk's death. For Bede, it was a living symbol of the pagan past that still physically dominated Rome's landscape, reminding everyone that the new Christian Rome had been built literally on the foundations of the old. But then, how did this sophisticated cultural reflection transform into the apocalyptic prophecy we know today? How did we go from an academic observation about the transfer of cultural power to a prediction about the world's end? The transformation of Bede's prophecy into apocalyptic legend teaches us something fundamental about how ideas are transmitted, transformed, and acquire new meanings across centuries. When the Colossus of Nero was finally demolished, sometime between the 10th and 11th centuries, people had already begun calling the neighboring amphitheater the Colosseum. Medieval copyists, who transcribed ancient texts without necessarily understanding all their nuances, began interpreting Colosseus as a reference to the building, not the statue. Bede's original prophecy, which spoke of a specific cultural symbol, transformed into a prediction about a physical monument. As the amphitheater suffered earthquakes, looting, and the wear of time, each falling block seemed to confirm the prophecy. During the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, when the Colosseum was systematically plundered to build palaces and churches, each new wound to its structure fed apocalyptic fears. But what does this tell us about our own era? Do we still see the Colosseum as Bede saw it, as a symbol of cultural continuity? Or do we see it as 19th century romantics did, as a warning about all civilization's fragility? And more importantly, which of these visions comes closer to the truth about our own historical moment? The story of the Colosseum prophecy teaches us something profound about the nature of historical change and cultural survival. The Venerable Bede wasn't an apocalypse prophet, but a keen observer of how civilizations transform without disappearing completely. His original prophecy recognized that 8th century Christian Rome had successfully inherited the authority and legitimacy of imperial Rome. The Colosseum still stands, Rome remains a world capital, and our world, though radically transformed since Bede's time, persists and evolves. Perhaps the prophecy's deepest essence, the idea of permanence through transformation, remains true. Every time we look at the Colosseum's ruins today, we're not just seeing the remains of a Roman amphitheater. We're seeing 1,000 years of European, Christian, and Western history stratified in stone. We're seeing the symbol of how civilizations die and are reborn, how the past becomes the foundation of the future. And now I ask you the question that could change your perspective on history and the present. What other symbols of permanence from our era might be sending messages that future generations will interpret completely differently? What monuments, what institutions, what ideas of our time will be reinterpreted by historians in the year 3024? Bede's manuscript reminds us that history isn't just what happened, but how each generation decides to interpret what happened. History's most famous prophecy about Rome's fall didn't really predict a fall, but a transformation. It didn't speak of the world's end, but of the birth of a new one. If this story has made you think differently about prophecies, monuments, and the way we interpret the past, share it. Because every time we question official versions of history, every time we seek original meanings behind legends, we're doing the same work that Bede did 1,300 years ago, trying to understand our place in the great chain of human civilization. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell